5, 4.
Hello and welcome to tonight's episode of New York Symposium with Diane Sayre for Friday, February 19th. This week and the last period of time in February have seen some extraordinary things happen. As of yesterday, the United States landed its rover, fifth rover, the Perseverance, on the planet Mars. And at the time that it landed, there were two other spacecraft that were hovering around that planet, one from China and one from the United Arab Emirates. The story of the UAE craft is particularly notable because the young woman who was heading up that mission, Dr. Sarah Al-Amiri, made the statement at the time that her mission was completed to Mars, the orbit, and what they're doing is looking at the atmosphere of Mars in particular. She talked about the fact that her nation, the United Arab Emirates, was constituted on December 7th, I believe it was, of 1971. And that was the same, or December 2nd, excuse me. And this was the same date that the humanity, as she put it, she didn't say the United States, it was the United States, first got an object onto the planet of Mars. And so she was talking about the idea that growing up as a young woman of 12, when she was trying to figure out the relationship between light and time, light years, that she never thought that she would be in the position of speaking to her nation about the idea of a Mars mission, and talked about this as a transformative moment for all of humanity. So tonight, three nations are hovering and dialoguing at the time at the planet Mars. And it says something about the nature of what we as humanity have to begin to think in terms of, not any longer ourselves as divided in various ways by language, by culture, and by nationality, but as a single human species. At the same time, clearly, nations and nation states in particular are the primary vehicle by which human progress not only has been achieved, but will continue to be achieved for reasons that we will discuss during the course of this tonight's dialogue symposium. And so we have a few speakers tonight, and we're going to be introducing them in just a moment. But first, we're going to hear from Diane Sayre, United States President, the United States senatorial candidate. Excuse me, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Running against Chuck Schumer, the senator from Wall Street. So, Diane.
Great, thanks very much. I think that happens because we have such a sorry excuse for president at the moment, who's barely present. Well, what we've had, the irony of the current situation is exactly as we are landing on Mars, we've just had 4.3 million Americans in Texas without electricity, many without running water. I think as of today, it was back to only 600,000 or less who did not have power or heat in sub-freezing temperatures. And you have a 14-state area that's part of the same electrical grid where the power failed. In some of these states, like I guess Kansas and Iowa, they have 40%, 30% of their energy supposedly coming from windmills, which simply froze, and really making very, very clear the potential breakdown of this insane environmentalist policy, which really began in the late 1960s. In fact, 1967 was the year that NASA was cut. The three Apollo missions was supposed to be up to 20, 18, 19, and 20 were eliminated from the budget, and we began to go green. And of course, solar and wind are so inefficient that you can't really do much of anything with them, and people are now experiencing that. However, the other aspect of this is the murderous intent of the financial institutions. If people remember Enron about 20 years ago, my goodness, what did they do? The energy was privatized, and they literally would shut down production So they could increase the price even up to 100 times what it cost. And they didn't care the impact that it had on people. And if you remember the tapes, the Enron executives were gloating over the suffering of people and what they were gloating about ripping off the state of California for $1 to $2 million per day. So one of the things that happened during this crisis in Texas is the people say, oh, well, by the law of supply and demand, this is really great because it will cause the people who charge a lot of money for energy to produce energy, as if money rules the world, as opposed to human cognition, as opposed to human creativity. So what I am very excited about is something that people have not considered for some time, which is how would we think about the development of the continent? What is really required to bring the United States into the 21st century? Because it's not just a matter of fixing some potholes or building a new bridge or this or that. All of those things we should be doing. But how do you actually think about a development on the magnitude that's required? How would Franklin Roosevelt have approached this, for example? And now that you have what China has done with the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think in some ways was directly or at least indirectly inspired by the trip of Helga Zepp-LaRouche to Beijing in 1996 and her insistence that the revival of the old Silk Road with corridors of high-speed rail, nuclear power development would be the way to transform the planet and to save the physical economy, which otherwise was jeopardized by this insane free trade gambling system. So I think I'll just stop right there. I'll have more to say later, but I'm really eager for you to hear what my colleagues have to present tonight.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is take you to Dennis Small, who is the Ibero-American representative for Executive Intelligence Review. Dennis has been at the core of several proposals that have happened over the course of the several decades that have been made by the LaRouche movement in various ways and in various eras. But there's a very specific proposal that recently we had discussed, and Dennis is going to tell us about that. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Bob Hux, who is also a representative for Canada for Executive Intelligence Review. So we start first with Dennis. So Dennis?
Good, thank you very much. What I want to talk to you about is how we can actually go about solving the problem that the entire species is facing at this point. It has everything to do with our immediate neighborhood, that is to say the Americas, North and South America, but it really is a question of defining what the overall problem is and going about solving it. It is usually a very good idea to know what the problem is before you try to solve it. Otherwise, you're going to make some pretty bad mistakes. And you know, it's like the guy who goes into the doctor's office and says, "Doc, you know, my back is sprained. I don't know what to do. It's really bad." And the doctor says, "Well, let's try some heat." Comes back, "No, it's still sprained." "Well, let's try surgery." "No, it's still sprained." And he comes in and the doctor says to him, "Well, Mr. Smith," and he says, "Mr. Smith, I'm Tarzan and I've been swinging from the chandeliers and I keep falling off." So, you know, that's kind of the way a lot of people go at the economy. They have absolutely no idea of what's actually causing the problem. And although the example may sound ridiculous, it actually is not nearly as ridiculous as the way most economists look at the problem that we're facing, which has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with trade per se. It has to do with what Lyndon LaRouche described and defined as a central metric of the economy, which is potential relative population density, which is when your physical economic apparatus is not strong enough to maintain the existing population, that population will drop. It will plummet one way or the other, whether by wars, whether by pandemic like today, whether by massive, cruel migration of populations from one area to another because they simply can't survive. And that's what we're dealing with. That's actually the problem that we're looking at today. Now, Linda LaRouche went at the problem in the Americas from the top down, which is to say, from the standpoint of what it is that drives actual economic recovery. How do you deal with a falling potential relative population density? And the key to that is what we saw in the Mars project that was just discussed a moment ago. The key to this is unending, continuous scientific advance where the entire platform of an economy is transformed. The basic unit of economic development is not production, it's not more production, it's not the people who produce production, it's none of that, as important as all of that is. It's the unending scientific discoveries that put man in coherence with the universal physical principles of the creative universe. And that's the central concept here, which is why this Mars mission is so critical to everything that humanity has to do. Now, the way Lyndon LaRouche addressed this thing in the case of the world economy is how to solve the problem of the underdevelopment of the southern nations is the key to resolving the problem of the entire planet. I want to start with a quote from LaRouche, which goes back to 1980. And this is in a private memorandum which Lyndon LaRouche wrote to then President-elect Ronald Reagan. This was December 18th, 1980. LaRouche had met Reagan on the campaign trail. There are famous pictures of them together in New Hampshire. And LaRouche sent a memorandum to Reagan right before he was sworn in. And what LaRouche said to Reagan is completely applicable to the situation today. What he said is, forging an oil for technology partnership with Mexico is only the first step in linking the advanced sector and the underdeveloped nations in a policy of global industrialization. Such a principled US-Mexican accord would set a precedent which virtually every developing nation will want to replicate. And then with total foresight of what was about to happen, LaRouche said, the crisis-racked Central American region could be stabilized in the only way possible, by US-Mexican collaboration to set in motion economic development projects in the region. Now, that lays out the concept of the kind of thing that needs to be done. The answer for the problems in the United States does not lie in the United States alone. It lies in the American role, as it always has over history since the founding of the Republic, in aiding the rapid development of other parts of the world and thereby creating a market for the export of our capital goods and so on and so forth. Now, there is a world project underway that is moving in that direction. It's called the World Land Bridge. We called it the World Land Bridge. The Chinese call it the Belt and Road Initiative. And what I'm going to put on the screen now is an overview map which we developed, which lays out the global picture from the standpoint of corridors of industrial development built around high-speed rail lines, which you can see in the red or the orangish lines across the entire globe. Some of these exist today, mainly in Eurasia. Some of them do not exist, mainly in the Americas. China has built 35,000 kilometers, that's over 20,000 miles, of high-speed rail line in their country. How many miles of high-speed rail line do you think we have in the United States? We have 0. We have some that they say is high speed on the corridor between Washington and Boston, but the trains don't run high speed because they're sharing the track with slower trains. So we don't have any high-speed rail in this country. However, this is the map of what the world can and will look like, and the Chinese are leading the way with their Belt and Road Initiative. The blue lines, the dotted lines, is the Maritime Silk Road. These are the sea routes through which international trade and commerce can be carried out because of the vastly increased trade that's required internationally. Now, what's involved in this is a science driver kind of project, which will bring to every area of the world a global expansion of that which is the driver of the economy, which is scientific advance, and the infrastructure projects that are required to make that scientific advance possible and to spearhead it. We have drawn circles on the map here to indicate just 4 of the major projects which are at the heart of LaRouche's proposal for the World Land Bridge. And in one sense, I've ordered them according to my view of what I think are the highest priority. They all have to be done together, but the things that will cause the biggest breakthroughs and breakouts of the world physical economy. First and foremost, the Bering Strait Tunnel. Now, there is already rail connecting nearly all the way up to the peninsula, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then the Russians have proposed, and they've studied in detail, building a tunnel under the Bering Strait, touching on using 2 of the islands, Big Diomede and Little Diomede, which are halfway across the strait, to be able to have a tunnel which would go down and then come up, and a tunnel go down and then come up to land, to reach into Alaska. There have been projects on the books to do this going way back. It must be adopted as a common policy of the Americas. It has to include the United States, starting with Alaska, Canada, through which the rail obviously must run, down into Mexico, through the United States, with high-speed rail lines to do this, and then from Mexico through Central America, dealing with this entire corridor of what is now underdevelopment and drug trade and massive migration, because people are simply impoverished and they can't survive. If you transform this area with high-speed rail and with industrial corridors around it, you can create an entirely different situation, employing the millions of people that are otherwise today forced to emigrate. They don't emigrate because they want to leave their families. They don't emigrate because they prefer to, eat at McDonald's. They immigrate because they're starving to death, because their children are controlled by drug gangs, because their family members have been killed. This has to be stopped, and it can with this kind of an industrial project. But then comes the second project, which will open up the entire planet, along with the Bering Strait Tunnel, to this kind of interconnected rail system. And that's the Darien Gap, which is the border area between Panama and Colombia. There's not even a highway that goes through there now. One of the problems is that it's rainy over 300 days out of 365 days of the year. It's very wet. So you have to construct these bridges and these high-speed rail lines with some ingenuity. You have to employ the kind of thinking that was employed to land Perseverance on Mars. There are studies that have been done, including by a close collaborator of ours at Executive Intelligence Review, Hal Cooper, designing the routes and locating exactly how you would go about doing this. For a good part of this route, you are going to have to build rail on land, but essentially on pylons which go down 10 and 20 and 30 feet, because it's watery 300 days a year. You cannot have a highway. It's almost like floating it on pontoons. That's another technique which has been used, incidentally, in the Amazon. You don't build a road in the Amazon on the ground. You build it on wood. And the reason you do that is because when it rains, it floats up. So anyway, there's all sorts of things that can be done. This would open up the entire area, the entirety of South America, to do what Lincoln did with the United States, which is to industrialize it on the basis of opening up these kinds of rail corridors. The Chinese have proposed, and it has not yet been implemented, to build rail corridors across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So these are the kinds of things that can be done. This is the Craw Canal, number 3, which would this is the busiest, most dangerous shipping route in the world, because so much world cargo goes through the Straits of Malacca. If you cut the Craw Canal through Thailand, which is a long-standing proposal in the area and of Mr. LaRouche's, you will vastly increase infrastructure capabilities. And then number 4, one of the key ways to open up Africa is you build a tunnel under the Gibraltar Strait connecting Spain to Morocco. And this has also been studied in great detail. It's absolutely doable. It's fairly deep, so you've got to go pretty far below the surface of the water. Obviously, you have to go down to the seabed in this case to do it. There are problems of the kind of soil which exists there, which you have to take into consideration with Martian-style engineering. And of course, since you have to go very deep over a short distance, you have to begin the tunnel in both ends a good distance away from the shore. Otherwise, you're going to be going down at 45 degrees, not recommended. Although if you're running a maglev train, you can take a much steeper incline than you could with a regular powered train. In any event, this is all doable. It can be done. What this means in terms of the region that we want to talk about today and to begin to focus on here is the North American region. And we have issued a proposal, and it dates back to really prior to the inauguration of Lopez Obrador as president of Mexico a few years back, where we issued the proposal for something which we called the North American version or the North American link to the Belt and Road Initiative. So the North American Belt and Road Initiative, or NABRI. And it has initials in Spanish too for the Mexicans. But the idea isn't the initials. The idea is, how do you actually link an area which is today being destroyed because the potential relative population density has sunk way below the actual population, and develop it? And the key is to do something like what we indicate here in this graphic, which this material has been presented to circles very close around the Mexican president. We've gotten it into circles at high levels in the United States as well. It can absolutely be done. What you need to do is turn the entire Caribbean basin into a crossroads of world scientific development, trade, and industrial capabilities. Now you'll see here some of the rail routes cutting through the Darien Gap. You will see the whole maritime Silk Road, which goes through the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, where most traffic towards the Panama Canal now goes. We've already widened the Panama Canal. We should build a new sea level canal in Nicaragua, as has been proposed, because the amount of trade is going to increase vastly. You can set up major industrial cities and ports in Ponce in Puerto Rico for transshipment of cargo into the United States. You have to build up the ports in the United States on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast to be able to handle very large modern super tankers and other large ships. You definitely want to build a major industrial port in Mariel in Cuba to bring the Cubans into this process of development. And you can see some of that indicated here on our map with these shipping routes. But the part that I really want to emphasize, because I think it's the key to the whole thing, is that our program calls for developing modern space science centers in Alcântara in Brazil, where there already is a space launch center in Brazil. Brazil has a respectable program. Economic austerity and the policies of Wall Street and the City of London have kind of knocked the stuffing out of it in recent years, but they absolutely have capabilities. It's very close to the equator, the closest spot of any launch site anywhere on the planet, which, as you may know, creates tremendous efficiencies of functioning. It's just much, much easier to get into orbit. The amount of thrust and energy you need to get payload into orbit is much less if you're right along the equator, which is why we launch from Cape Canaveral, which is as far south as we can get in the United States. The other very important space center now is in Kourou, which is French Guiana. That's part of France. It's a territory, which is colonial territory, which is part of France, but it is the launch center for the European Space Agency. That's where they launch their satellites from, because it's also very near the equator. Now, if you develop these areas as not only launch sites, but the locations where you can bring in the population, today immiserated population of many of these areas, of the Caribbean, of Haiti, of Central America, and so on, and bring them into training programs with NASA, with the Chinese, and parenthetically, the Chinese have to be involved in all of this. And it's not because they have money and we don't. That's not the point. The point is that they have a capability of actually building things which we've lost, which we don't have now. If you want to build a high-speed rail line, you better talk to the Chinese, because we've lost that capability in the United States and it's got to be regained. So the Chinese need to be involved in all of this. It's the perfect form of cooperation between the United States and Canada. The United States and China for the development of this region, exactly of the sort Lyndon LaRouche proposed to Ronald Reagan. that's exactly the way to get the United States economy back on its feet. Now, if you use these centers in Alcantara and in Curu to bring in training, labor force for training from different countries, you will be able to create a science driver economy throughout the region to take areas that are now very impoverished, but where you have a capability of a labor force that can be developed. The stepping stone to that is you take areas of these countries which are now involved in raw materials extraction, both oil, bauxite and aluminum. Is huge deposits of bauxite and aluminum in Suriname, in Guyana, Jamaica, and other countries. But by and large, it's looted. It's simply taken, they get dollars, and they pay their debt, and they get nothing for it. So it's pure raw materials extraction. If you establish upstream development capabilities of the in terms of processing that, and then downstream industries which make use of this, you begin to train a labor force, which in turn can be conveyed into the space science centers, the most advanced areas of scientific knowledge. And that's the direction where this whole thing has got to go. The specifics around what this means for Mexico and the United States, you can see here how these rail links would tie in with Mexico. China has proposed to Mexico 3 major rail projects, all of which are good. There's good, there's better, and there's best. Good is this high-speed rail line from Mexico to Querétaro, which is a relatively large industrial city in Mexico. All set to go until the British said no, the Obama administration said no, and Mexico had to cave, and they could not go ahead with this. It would have been the first high-speed rail line in the entire Western Hemisphere, since we ain't got none in our country. Second, better proposal, simultaneous with this, is the idea of a rail line to be built from Nayarit on the western coast of Mexico to Ciudad Juarez, which is across from El Paso in Texas. This would be for transshipment of cargo coming from the east, from China and so on, and to have a rail link directly into the United States rail system. This is a very good project. It should be built. It hasn't been built. One of the good things you would be able to do is you destroy the base of operations of the drug trade if you do something like this, because a large part of it, if you've heard of the Sinaloa cartel, this is Sinaloa right here, immediately north of Nayarit. Take development into these areas, people will not be forced and driven into the drug trade. But the best of all, the most important one, which Lyndon LaRouche has proposed for a long time and worked with then President Lopez Portillo to bring about, is this cross-isthmus high-speed rail line between the ports of Salina Cruz on the Pacific and Coatzacoalcos on the Gulf Coast in Mexico. This is like another Panama Canal. This is a transshipment point at a very narrow part of the continent, which would be extremely useful for general development of the region and for the kind of employment of people in the projects that would actually give meaning to their lives. So this is the kind of direction which the United States can and must move in. This is win-win-win. This is win for the United States because it allows us to develop the economy that we need for our country and also for the capital goods exports to parts of the world that desperately need it. It's win for the entire region of Mexico, Central America, where today you have mass migration because the potential relative population density has dropped way below its current population. And that's why you have this mass migration phenomenon. You have 10, 15% of Mexicans who have migrated to the United States because the population, the economy of Mexico cannot maintain them. It can't keep them alive because it's been destroyed by the Wall Street and City of London banking system. 25% of Salvadorans have moved to the United States. Don't blame the Salvadorans for it. Blame Dope Inc., blame Wall Street, blame the British, blame the people who have actually created the conditions of genocide that have made it required for a quarter of El Salvador's people to flee their own country. And believe me, they love their own country as much as you and I love ours, but they've been driven out of it because of these global situations. Now, That's another win situation. And of course, it's a win in terms of China and what's probably the critical question of world stability, which is US-China cooperation to take the world out of the current disaster which has been created and bring it into an entirely new paradigm and a new era. Mars is the wave of the future. It's the direction we must go. And of course, there is another win in this, and that's Canada. I'll leave that to Bob Hucks to discuss with us.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Dennis. Bob, I think you're up. Make sure you're unmuted.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Can I have the first slide? Jenny? Okay. Yeah, I wanted to start actually with, this is a conference that Lyndon LaRouche addressed, a meeting that we pulled together in Ottawa in December of 2007. And entitled, as you can see, Canada and the Coming Eurasian World. And, you know, keeping in mind, this is 2007. This is what, 4 or 5 months after LaRouche's July 25th, 2007 announcement that there's no way that the existing transatlantic financial system can survive. It's going through a fundamental transformation. So he says here, I don't know if people were able to read the text very clearly. He says, we're presently at a point of a great world crisis. It's one of the biggest, probably will be, unless we can control it, the biggest crisis in modern European history. We had something in the 14th century, the so-called New Dark Ages, with collapse of a number of the banks of Italy, the Lombard banks, so-called. We're facing something similar today, but in a different time with different characteristics. And then he says, there are remedies, but the remedies require a certain kind of optimism about the future of mankind. And here we are in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, which essentially is the hardcore of the Northern Hemisphere of the Americas. We're also at a point, we have an option for close development with parts of Asia, particularly the Russian part of Asia. The connection between Northern Siberia and Northern Alaska and Canada is fairly obvious. Here we have areas to the northern part of the hemisphere in 2 continents, which are very thinly populated, but rich in mineral resources and other kinds of resources, and also which are capable of supplying improvements in water management, fresh water management of the respective continents of the northern part of the continents. So then if I can just have the next slide. So you can get a bit of a sense of what he's referring to in terms of the northern part of the North American continent being sparsely populated. This is a map of the existing railroad grid of North America. And it's quite interesting that at this time, there were actually initiatives underway to do something about this. I can have the next slide. This is a proposal for an Arctic shipping route that was actually used between Churchill, Manitoba, which is, as you can see, on Hudson's Bay, not quite up to the Arctic Circle. So this is the ability to link into the North American railroad grid that you just saw on the previous slide, and to most efficiently get freight and various kind of commodities from the central part of Canada across to Northern Europe or across to Russia. Could I have the next slide? So we see October 2007, a couple of months before this conference that Mr. LaRouche addressed in Ottawa, Churchill Port welcomes first ever Russian shipment. A ship loaded with fertilizer from northwestern Russia arrived in Churchill on Wednesday, the first time the northern Manitoba port has received goods from Russia. The shipment on the Murmansk Shipping Company vessel is considered the first of an Arctic bridge linking the Canadian prairie and Russian markets. Up until now, Churchill has mainly been used to ship grain out of Canada to Europe and North Africa and to receive supplies for communities farther north in Canada. So I have the next slide. So this is a little bit later, August of 2013, Port of Churchill, gateway to Northern Europe for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and North Dakota sweet crude oil. What you're seeing here just at the very top right corner of the map is the Port of Churchill. And then you're seeing the rail connection going south from Churchill down to the rail grid that you saw earlier of North America. So these are the kind of considerations that that have been in terms of opening up this capability. And this was a route that was quite extensively used when Canadian grain farmers in the prairies had the Canadian Wheat Board, which maintained not only the ability to negotiate a price with Canadian grain farmers and not having to have them fight against the grain cartels, but they would use this shipment out of the Port of Churchill to be able to have much cheaper shipments internationally. And this went into a lot of disuse after the Canadian Wheat Board was broken up several years back. So can I have the next slide there? So here's, this is right around the time that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was coming in as Prime Minister. This is December 2015. The election was a couple of months earlier. Rarely used Arctic shipping route offers path to Canada-Russia reconciliation. So people sort of remember what was happening around that time. You had the targeting of Ukraine, the organized destabilization of Russia. Yet during this period, have the next slide. So the person you see on the left is Stéphane Dion, who in the early year, first year of the first Justin Trudeau government was the Foreign Minister of Canada. And you can see shaking hands with Sergei Lavrov, the Foreign Minister of Russia. Next slide. So this occurred in July 2016 at the ASEAN summit in Laos. And this is what the Canadian Foreign Minister said. To continue on the importance of cooperation, let's insist on the crucial relationship that must exist between Canada and Russia. Almost 50% of the North is Russian, and some 25% is Canadian. Between us, we control 75% of the North. Preventing scientists from these countries from talking is illogical. Our government has put an end to this irrationality. To sever the links with Russia, our neighbor, serves the interests of no one. Neither Canadians, nor Russians, nor Ukrainians, no one. But unfortunately, that view of the relationships between Canada and Russia did not last very much longer into the first Trudeau government. I don't have to go into the reasons why at the moment. Could I have the next slide? So returning again to this sort of physical characteristics of the continent that we live on. And I think it's important to sort of look at this from the standpoint that these questions of the policies that governments adopt to some extent at certain times in history are shaped by ideological aberrations, you might say, but the physical reality of the conditions under which people live also has a moving force. So can I have the next slide? So this refers on the left to an article written by Lyndon LaRouche in appeared in the Executive Intelligence Review, May of 2007. You see on the right side, Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche arriving in Moscow, April 2007, at a conference entitled A Transcontinental Eurasia-America Transport Link via the Bering Strait. And this was an article that LaRouche wrote in terms of the importance of making a connection between the North American rail grid and the other aspects of infrastructure up not only to Alaska, but across the Bering Straits. Can I have the next slide? So there you have the, in rough outline, you can see a schematic of the rail grid for United States, Canada. You can see the line going up, through Alaska. You can see the location of the Bering Strait that Dennis showed earlier. Can I have the next slide? This is an artist's conception commissioned by Hal Cooper, the engineer that the Lyndon LaRouche and our movement have worked with for many years, who did all of the engineering studies, feasibility studies for this extensive world land bridge in many areas. This is what a proposed Alaska-Canada rail corridor would look like, according to the commissioned artist Craig Thorpe. The next slide. So this is something that has been at various points over a period of over a century, periodically taken on a life of its own in terms of this project to connect the North American rail grid up through Canada up to Alaska, and to be able to have the possibility of going further. This is in the end of September of 2020, President Donald Trump had signed a border crossing permit to allow rail track to be laid across the border between Alaska and Canada. And the rail company that was given the right to proceed with this is called the Alaska to Alberta Railway Corporation, or A2A Rail. And this is a schematic of the rail route that they're now engaged in doing all the feasibility studies for. The northern area of Alberta, where you see the star at the end of the proposed rail line, that's roughly the location of Fort McMurray. People might know of Fort McMurray in terms of the oil sands, or some people call them the tar sands. Now, one of the considerations in terms of why such a project would move ahead and why now has to do with, on the first hand, of the oil that is produced by Canada. 97% of Canada's oil is exported to the United States. Now, there has been sort of a long standing problem for people in Alberta and these central prairie provinces that want to develop their oil resources in terms of not having the ability to transport it any place but to the United States, in terms of limited pipeline capacity. And the present government of Prime Minister Trudeau has sort of made things a little bit worse by declaring a oil tanker ban, not allowing oil tankers to access the Pacific coast of British Columbia north of the northern tip of Vancouver Island up to the Alaska Panhandle. So in other words, the idea of even trying to move the oil from northern Alberta by pipeline to a port on British Columbia is quite problematic. Obviously, it's not simply a Canadian question. There are various interests in the United States that are very interested in seeing these energy markets be moved. And the Canadian government of Prime Minister Trudeau came in, I'll get to that in a minute also, with this idea of obviously Canada's number one trade partner, the closest integration of the economy is between the United States and Canada. But if that's the only country you're easily able to make trade with, it's problematic. So it's been the idea of diversifying markets and diversifying the ability to communicate physically and transport corridors to other areas of the world. So this is a project that is proceeding. There have been, as far as I'm aware of, meetings in Alaska with two of the communities through which such a railroad would travel. The various surveying is going on in the Canadian section of the of the proposed route. But it's sort of a long-term perspective in terms of when this thing will go ahead. Let's see. Yeah, could I have the next slide? Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, and this, as I said, these questions of the physical economy, the physical reality, often will determine the possibilities that nations have and what they're able to accomplish. This is a picture of the two nuclear power plants, the two CANDU nuclear reactors that were built in China. The construction started, I believe, in 1994. Now, the conditions under which this occurred are sort of interesting to look at. In 1994, when the Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was elected, he decided, number one, he did not want to back the United States in the war against Iraq. And also, he took a sort of objection to the North American Free Trade Act and had this idea of Canada diversifying trade with other areas of the world. So he developed what was called Team Canada, government officials, various businessmen going around the world to be able to promote Canadian technology, including to China. Now, what had happened earlier in 1989, I believe, was the year that you had the unfortunate development in China with the Tiananmen Square massacre. The United States imposed sanctions on China, so China's ability to ask the United States to help them develop their nuclear capabilities was not there. Also in 1989, the Soviet Union had collapsed, so the other major nuclear power developer was not available to help China. So Canada got the opportunity to do this sort of perspective. And to this day, in spite of all the various geopolitical frictions that exist at the moment between Canada and China, this appears to be one of the things that is going ahead, that China is interested in developing this CANDU technology, particularly because this technology, the heavy water reactors are able to take spent nuclear fuel from what's called a light water nuclear reactor. Most of the reactors that are used around the world are the light water reactors like you have in the United States. It can take the spent fuel from 4 of those nuclear reactors, and that still has enough uranium in it to fuel a CANDU reactor. And so China is interested in this because they don't have large supplies of uranium and for other reasons. I'm doing on time here. So anyway, I could sort of raise more questions related to this question of Canadian nuclear policy, and I have some other things that if people want to ask about. So why don't I just sort of leave it there for the moment?
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Bob. Diane, let's go right back to you. And why don't you tell your constituents why you have these two gentlemen speaking about Canada, Mexico, Brazil, French Guiana, you know, all this, right? And I mean, maybe, yeah, there's NAFTA, but what's this got to do with you?
Well, actually, I really appreciate our friend, the late Hal Cooper. When I spoke with him and actually Mr. LaRouche a few years ago in 2017, I think it was, when the New York City subway system was just disintegrating. And we were having choir rehearsals and people were showing up late because there were fires on the subway. There were water mains breaking, really crazy. And we talked about what would you do if you really wanted to modernize the transportation system around New York City. Now, also, I had been at a conference hosted by Cranes, New York, where they were discussing this. And the thing that really struck me is that no one had a plan for growth. You know, Grand Central Station, I think, or is it Penn Station? Maybe it's Penn Station. No, Grand Central. Grand Central Station was designed for something like a maximum throughput of 250,000 people a a day. Now, not now after COVID, but in 2017, it was 650,000 people per day. The tunnels under the Hudson River are 111 years old. Steel, which is what they're made of, or this cast iron, which is very thick, but it does get corroded by salt water, and Sandy did more damage. It has a safe life of a century. So we're already 10 years over that. We have no redundancy whatsoever. And again, pre-COVID, the traffic was such that if you were going to repair the tunnels and divert all that traffic to car or bus, the infrastructure the other way would break down. You actually are at such a situation that you can't repair this. So Mr. LaRouche said, well, why don't you put together a committee to look at this? And he said, you've got to consider a few things. One, what is it going to look like if you do nothing? And two, how do you address this? And Hal Cooper, who is such a brilliant mind, and I must say, like Lyndon LaRouche, and even more in detail because of he's an engineer, rail engineering, has a map of the entire planet in his head in great detail. And he said, well, the way to think about New York is that New York is going to be the at one end of the railroad that goes across the Bering Strait Tunnel, that you don't think about building the state. It makes no sense unless it's connected to everything else. So for the United States to function, and we just heard, I didn't realize that 97% of the oil from Canada is purchased by the United States. We do not exist in a vacuum. We have nations that neighbor us on the south and on the north. And if we want to see a rapid increase in our standard of living, then it would make sense to increase trade with these nations. But if you're going to increase trade, you have to have transportation. The speed of a freight train, the average speed of a freight train in the United States right now is 17 miles per hour. I think in the 1960s, it was 37 or 48 miles per hour. I mean, we really, we're at a point now where if we don't address this and we don't address it from the top and on the scale that's required, we are going to have a collapse, which will be so fast. It'll be like when you go over the top of a roller coaster and you go down and your stomach ends up outside your mouth somewhere. That's what we're looking at. And unless people think of it on this scale, it's not going to work.
I just would make one comment. Obviously, New York City has always been an international city. Also, you said something about what Hal said concerning the idea of thinking about the city as being the end point of a rail system that did not yet exist. And he had a sort of a conception of a New York City of the future, which would imply that there was a lot more trade, a lot more manufacturing, a lot more infrastructure changes that would be going on here. And maybe let me just ask if Dennis, you have a view, given all the work that you did in Central and South America and the fact that you've been involved in the design of these programs, what is your notion of how the United States is directly and immediately impacted, not merely in terms of what gets built, but its self-conception?
Dennis, you're muted.
I was looking for my microphone. Actually, I was looking for my mouse on the microphone. Put the two together. I think the way to think about this is to come back to the theme we started this all with, is think about what we have to do the same way these projects are being thought about in Mars. The objective of perseverance, among other things, besides gaining knowledge and science along the way, is to drill into down a couple of feet or yards into the soil and extract some samples, which are then being placed in some tubes, which have been sent up extraordinarily clean, as NASA was describing it, sealed, and left to be picked up in 10 years. I mean, this is amazing. This is exactly how people should be thinking. You know, here's this, hold on, I'll be back. Just hold on a sec, I'll be back. It'll just be 10 years. And then you're already planning what your next mission is. What is the sense that you have of yourself, of your children, of your grandchildren's future if the way you're approaching scientific discovery is like that? Now, this comes naturally to the younger engineers, and there were plenty of them visible on the NASA floor, the people who built this thing. But that's exactly how we have to go about our relations with the entire world. The poverty that exists in this country and around the world is the worst imaginable thing, not just because of the poverty, but because it induces into those who accept it a sense of pessimism about the nature of man and human spirit, which is the most destructive, corrosive thing that you can possibly imagine. When people look around and see misery and poverty, and they see pictures of children starving around the world, and their response is, oh, well, that's really too bad, and go about their business and think there's nothing can be done, that's absolutely damaging the most fundamental thing about those people. Whereas the contrary view, think of the optimism that comes, as we've just demonstrated on Mars, but as China has just demonstrated. China in 4 decades brought 850 million people out of poverty. Now, they're not living the life of Riley. They're not all, skilled engineers and biophysicists, but they don't live in poverty anymore. And they view that they have a future which is of growth, of expansion, and so on. That change in the way people think about themselves, about their country, about the world, is probably the single most important impact that these kinds of projects will have. If we look, Linda LaRouche said this when he visited Peru. He went to Peru, he flew over the Amazon to get to Peru. It was a trip that I was fortunate enough to be along with him on that to as his interpreter in the various speeches and meetings that he had. And one of the most famous of these is he told people in Peru, when people look at Peru, they see poverty. I see potential. There's no reason in the world, and this was in 1987, I believe, 84, 87, I don't remember which, but it was a long time ago. He said, there's no reason in the world that one of those poor little Peruvian children, a little girl you see on the street begging, is not going to be the first astronaut to land on Mars. And think of what that does to people's state of mind, to be able to think that way and for it to be real. And I think that's what's most important about the kind of economic projects and development approach that we've been discussing here today.
Bob, I wanted to ask you something because you referenced the CANDO project and you referenced how Canada was tapped by China to do something with respect to, at that time, nuclear capability. I think, as you said, it was at the time of 89, 90, that period. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's interesting to look at the map of Canada itself. When you look at the rail map, you see virtually no rail systems. Now some might assume, oh, that's because the terrain is just so frosty or something, you can't have railway. And in addition, you've talked about a very advanced nuclear capability. So could you say something about why and how Canada, which is very closely related to the United States, you already said it's the #1 trade partner. Everybody knows about the close relationship, for better or worse. Say something to us about how you see this proposal that's been put forward about NAPRI, but also specifically how what Canada could be doing. What would it be its choice or role in this?
Well, the nuclear industry is sort of a good example. Canada is one of maybe half a dozen countries that does have a full cycle nuclear industry, from the mining of the uranium to the design of reactors, to the construction, to the scientific research and development, the nuclear regulatory capabilities. I was looking recently, Canada has nuclear agreements with about 88 countries around the world For example, people from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission were involved several years ago in basically educating people in Ghana in terms of if they have a perspective for developing nuclear power, what do they have to do? So it has this capability. At the moment, there is significant investment being made into the Canadian nuclear laboratories in Chalk River, just upstream on the Ottawa River, north of Ottawa. So you have the ability of companies that are attempting to develop these small modular reactors, whether they're from Canada, from the United States, or from many places around the world, collaborating with people in Canada. For example, the nuclear laboratories have the ability to sort of provide the laboratory services for some of these companies. But the sort of thing that holds it back is this geopolitical orientation that tends to constrain the nuclear industry. If you look at what we have published in terms of the shortage of electrical power and the role that nuclear power could play, whether they're small reactors or large reactors, the point that Ramtanu Maitra, who is a nuclear engineer who has written for EIR before, he has said many times that there doesn't physically exist, and that's probably still the case today, the capacity to build enough nuclear reactors. So instead of getting into a sort of a fight with China or Russia and saying we want to be able to build these reactors first, we should be collaborating with these nations to bring the technologies to bear. Other capabilities that Canada has in terms of water management. Canada has one of the companies that is involved in developing one part of the Trans-Aqua project for Africa. It's not the whole project, but one element of it. So Canada has the capabilities that if it was unleashed from this British sort of imperial mindset, could contribute a lot in many different areas.
Okay. We got a question that came in across YouTube about the North American Water and Power Alliance, an old project that has been around since the 1960s. The LaRouche organization spoke about it many different times. But I guess the question essentially was, what about that? Is that something that still is viable? Does it relate to what we're talking about here about this NABRI idea? If so, not so, or what's it? So Dennis, I'm going to direct that to you. And I think we have a map of the project actually that's available that Jenny or someone could be able to put up.
Okay, that's actually always very useful to take a look at a map like that. Yeah, a water project like NWAPA is good, but it's not a breakthrough in terms of the way in which man relates to his entire environment in the biosphere. Because it's very good to transfer water from one basin to another. It's very good where you take water from where you have an excess of it and take it to another area where you don't have enough of it. This is what dams and water projects have done throughout history, and it's very good. And this is a very good idea too. You can take 15 to 16% of the runoff that goes from the major rivers in the north of Canada and Alaska and so on, that run off into the Arctic Ocean and so on, and to which, you know, they don't really do a whole lot for the development of the biosphere. And instead, if you were to bring them down south, force a change to bring it down south through the Rocky Mountain Trench, and then raise it through this this Montana pump lift up over into the divide, you can then actually create another Mississippi River, which would be a very good idea to do. And you can create a huge amount of irrigated land. You can recharge aquifers like the Ogallala Aquifer, which is running dry. You can bring it down not only from Canada into the United States, but you can then cross over into Mexico. And this entire region of the Great American Desert, which covers the United States, southwestern United States, and north central Mexico, which is a desert. Parts of it are arid, parts of it are only semi-arid, but it all desperately needs water. You have a country like Mexico, which is in subsidence because it is exhausting its aquifers, it's drawing them down. The amount of water that you need is more than is provided by the normal hydrological cycle. So why not bring water, correct some of the mistakes that the biosphere has made along the way. We're part of the noosphere. We've got ingenuity. Why don't we do something like that? That's good. And the same kinds of things, by the way, can be done in Asia. The Aral Sea, which is suffering similar problems, you simply do the same kind of thing. There's rivers that run north into the Arctic Ocean through Russia. Also, you simply can rechannel that south. You can do a huge amount with it. All fine and good. But what's really interesting, and what we should be doing, is actually manufacturing fresh water. And this can absolutely be done. You're not limited to the amount of fresh water which the hydrological cycles provide, contrary to what we're told. I mean, the greenies say you can't even move the water around. You don't touch it. How dare you? So you can not only move it around, but you can do better than that. You can actually manufacture fresh water. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One, which is very well known, is you desalinate water, which does function. It does work. The largest plants are in Saudi Arabia. But to really be effective from a physical economic standpoint, you have to have nuclear energy to desalinate because it requires a huge amount of energy to do that. Absolutely worth investing in. That's one of the things. But what's really interesting is it's sort of like the difference between solar energy on Earth and the way the sun produces energy, which is fusion power. It's totally different to say, well, let's take what we can here, and to say, no, let's us reproduce this process. Well, why don't we look at the way weather is actually formed? Why don't we look at the way there are huge flows of water and water vapor and so on in the atmosphere? Why don't we look at the question of ionization processes, which have been investigated and need to be investigated further, so that the entire hydrological process is altered by man to the benefit of the entire biosphere? Now, I'm not pointing to that one form of technology, this ionization thing, as the magic solution. In discussions with LaRouche, he was very specific on this. It's interesting, investigate it. Don't propose it as the answer, because we don't know. But there has been research done on this. Mexico and other places, Russian scientists. This is the kind of area we should look into. And I believe the Canadian Arctic in particular offers tremendous opportunities for this is a version of space science, back to Mars, brought down to Earth to resolve some of our problems. So NWAPA is good. I think we should absolutely do it. But what we really need is a shift in the entire technological platform. That's when the fun begins.
One of the things that you just brought up there, which does become interesting from the standpoint of thinking about the United States, Russia, China, and Canada, is the Arctic. And the fact that when you look at a polar map or look at the world from the standpoint of the pole, you see that the interconnection or the potential interconnection of those nations. Matter of fact, we showed that in one of the earlier land bridge maps.
Here, let me share my screen on this. I just happen to have a map, which is a polar projection of the world land bridge. I don't know if you have that on the screen now. Hopefully
Yes.
you do.
Yes,
So the labels are in Spanish, but you get an idea of what the world looks like from above in exactly the way you're talking about.
Yeah. If you want to say any more about that, or Bob, you have anything to say about this element? Because you brought it up concerning the Canadian Wheat Board earlier, and the fact that there was a whole process that was underway. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would just say in terms of NWAPA is the number one and number two natural disasters hitting Canada are either flooding or droughts. So I really appreciated Mr. LaRouche's shift in emphasis away from, at one point he said, okay, you've looked at what's happening on the ground in terms of how you build dams and reservoirs and shift water here and there, but what's happening in the atmosphere. You have to look at this from a higher level. And that's really the question, because in many cases, the areas that are flooding are not necessarily close to where your water transport canals are. So what you would really want to do, perhaps this ionization method could be used to do this, influence where the rain falls so that it falls where you want it to fall, or prevent it from falling in certain places where you don't want it to fall. So I think there's a lot more that can be developed in that area.
Yeah, one of the other reasons I brought this up, of course, is because everybody's worried about the question of warming. But actually, the idea that there's a certain amount of warming going on at the Arctic happens to be not only a good thing, it's a fact. And you have, these whole discussions now about the possibilities of development of the Arctic. I don't know if you have more that you'd like to say about that. But just on the point you just made, there's a completely different platform of technology that's possible. I think the other element concerning NWAPA is well, as you already made the point. It's looked at. It's a bottom-up view. You take a top-down view, no pun intended, in terms of the map we're looking at. If you take a top-down view and if you think about space science and think about the things that can be done, including joint work on Earth, and specifically in an area like the poles, on this project, I think that becomes a rather interesting, like people have talked about the issues of how you're going to mine the permafrost in Siberia, for example. That's one of the topics that's sometimes discussed. So I think we're pretty much coming up on time, because we're about at 9:15. So Diane, I think maybe the best thing would be to take some summary remarks. So if there's anything, Bob, you either haven't said or would like to say at this point, it's a good time.
No, I think that's pretty much what I had to say.
Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, I've got to come back to the Mars question. It's simply a demonstration of the most exciting form of what we are capable of. And as you said from the outset on this thing, these were three nations. How disparate could you get? Here you have the United Arab Emirates, recently formed. You have China, and you have the United States. And there's a certain amount of direct cooperation going on. But think of the image. Think of the image of these three nations all dealing with issues from the standpoint of Mars and our joint work and cooperative work up there, which is the approach that can be used to deal with a situation here down on Earth. With science being that which drives the world's physical economy forward, it's very clear that we have to bring this kind of approach down to Earth to deal with the panoply of problems that we have. Maybe what we need is to, besides voting Diane in as a senator from the state of New York, finally you need a representative who doesn't represent Wall Street, but actually represents the state of New York. It might be better served to have the entirety of Congress populated by little green Martians, if we think of it the right way. That would be good.
All right, so
some people might think it already is.
that's already happened. So but that's another question.
That's an insult to Martians.
But they're not green, they're red.
Okay.
That's right. Even the Martians do not approve of the Green New Deal. All right. So Diane, you have some things you'd like to say to sort of pull this all together?
Sure. Bob brought up the fact that President Trump was the one who signed the I don't know if you want to call it a waiver or whatever for this cross-border rail, the A2A, Alaska to Alberta rail, which is major and no one knows about it. And we have a situation in the United States where the press is trying to sort of erase Donald Trump, who was president of the United States for 4 years, in a way not unlike what they did to the great singer Paul Robeson. In the case of Trump, it's not about Trump personally, although it's also that because of certain things that he did, like pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accord, which is really a banker's dictatorship. But it's about the presidency of the United States and the power of that agency, not as an individual, but what Lyndon LaRouche was part of by virtue of his campaigns for the presidency and his connections from the military, from his diplomatic work, his work with Ronald Reagan, of people who felt themselves responsible for the the general welfare and the principle of our nation as a republic. This is very much under attack. This is what these bankers said. Mark Carney, head of the Bank of England at Jackson, he's not anymore now. He's at the UN doing something on climate, but appropriately. We need regime change. No more sovereign nations. No one is allowed to act in the interests of people that they represent, and you're not allowed to represent people, as we saw in this last election, so-called election. So this is really urgent because the citizens have to demand that the kind of projects that you've seen here come into existence. And that means going to these people who are elected or running for office yourself, but don't presume that because you don't officially have a title or what you would consider power, that you're not able to do this. The reason for the desperation, for the censorship, the fraud, is that the old system of the transatlantic, that is the British liberal imperial system, is completely bankrupt. What China is doing is not bankrupt. That's why they have actually had a reasonable rate of growth, even in spite of COVID, which they also dealt with very successfully. And the greatest fear that these people have is cooperation between the United States and China, which is exactly what we have to bring about. So I think I'll just say that there's an important meeting tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Maybe Dennis, you want to say something about that. And then next Friday on my symposium, we're going to be talking about nuclear power. People should have learned something, I hope, from these horrible blackouts. I hope we will have people from New York who can talk to us about what's happening with Indian Point, which is scheduled. The final reactor there is going to be shut down on April 30th. There's absolutely no way this is going to be replaced by solar and wind. They did build another, I forget what it's called. There's another power plant that's been built recently, which is helping to take care of some of this, but the shutdown of nuclear power is completely insane. So we're going to be continuing this discussion. We'll be taking this up next Friday at 8. And then Saturday will be a roundtable discussion that Mrs. LaRouche is organizing about crushing the Great Reset and the importance of the relationship between the US, China, and Russia. So that's what I can say.
Well, before I talk about what we're going to be doing tomorrow too, Dennis, maybe you should say something about what Helga Sepp-LaRouche is going to be doing tomorrow with some young people.
Yeah, there's going to be an international conference discussion of youth with Helga Sepp-LaRouche. These have been held every couple of months. The LaRouche movement is in the process of organizing an international youth movement across the planet, because people understand, young people especially understand, that the only way to actually change this paradigm profoundly is everywhere, internationally. So we expect the participation of people not only from the United States. There's going to be a very large contingent from Ibero-America, also from France, also from Africa, and undoubtedly a few other countries. We always do these with simultaneous interpretation into various languages, so that everyone can exchange ideas freely and fully. So I think this is going to be a very exciting meeting, and there will undoubtedly be reports back from that to all the interested people.
Yes, and tomorrow at 2 o'clock, what will happen is we'll be doing our regular Manhattan town meeting. Diane will be there. She'll be joined by Gerald Rose. He's going to be continuing a discussion that Jerry's been doing for some time. Actually, he's been a guest on that meeting a few times, on President Franklin Roosevelt and his 4 freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear everywhere in the world. But to give you a sense of what the intent is, I will also point out that there will be a sort of surprise guest who will be Lyndon LaRouche speaking to a group of youth back in 2003, which will be preceding Jerry Rose, and is a sort of our way of continuing the discussion that Helga Sepp-LaRouche will begin in the morning, not on the platform that you'll be seeing, but with these young people. But just in my own way of summarizing sort of the purpose of what we're going to be talking about and what we'd like you all to be involved with us in, with is we've got a report which talks about the idea of the Great Leap Backward. Lyndon LaRouche exposes the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. And that report is now in circulation. It's available in various ways. We invite you also to tune in tomorrow. We'll be talking about that a bit more as well. But I wanted to make sure that I left you with the words of Sarah Al-Amiri. We referenced her before. She is the head of the United Arab Emirates Mars mission. And she said this. She said, look, our story is a story of transformation. It's my story and the story of the 200 other people that have worked with me on this mission. Said that this has been an internationally collaborative mission that has involved 450 souls working on this mission across continents, time zones, working together to ensure that this mission arrives on time toward the destination. Because for us, the mission is about the next 50 years. So the destination is actually not Mars, but the next 50 years. This is the idea we often have talked about the future determining the present. And the concept of what we're going to be trying to get across both tomorrow and in general in our campaign around this report or the issuing of this report is to qualify those persons that are going to be supporting Diane in her endeavor for the United States Senate to think about making policy right now. So we want a system of conferences each week, just like this dialogue, and which involves increasingly you and your neighbors and all kinds of other people, not just in terms of asking questions, but also telling us what are the problems in comprehension, or what did you find when you tried to organize somebody else? And how should we go after this idea? What do we mean by organizing other people? So all of this will be the topic of tomorrow's Manhattan meeting, and we invite you all to join us there. So I think that's going to wrap it up for us for this evening. So on behalf of New York Symposium with Diane Sayre, we want to say good night to you all, but also ask you to work with us to make this campaign as widely known as possible. And stay with us and stay with our initiative. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.